The gurney wheels caught in a crack in the pavement and tilted, and the old man's hands came up from the blanket in a slow, uncertain way. The way hands come up when a person is not sure whether to brace for a fall or just let it come. It was raining. Not the dramatic kind, not a storm that announces itself. Just the gray, patient kind that settles over a city in November and doesn't apologize for being there. The kind that soaks through a blanket in about 4 minutes. No one was watching. That was the part that would stay with Colt Deering longer than anything else he witnessed that afternoon. If this story sits with you the way it sat with him, consider subscribing and staying until the very end. There's a reason it matters. Colt had parked his truck 2 blocks from the VA Medical Center to avoid the lot fees. He did that every Tuesday when he brought Bruno in for the animal-assisted therapy program, which was a formal way of saying he walked a very large German shepherd through a series of hallways and let people reach out and touch his dog. Bruno did the actual work. Colt just held the leash. He had been doing it for 11 weeks, ever since a social worker named Diane had stopped him outside a coffee shop, seen Bruno sitting at his left knee with the focused patience of a dog who knew his job and asked if they had ever considered volunteering. Colt had said he would think about it. He started the following Tuesday. He had not missed a Tuesday since. It was not a thing he talked about. He had spent 9 years in the Marine Corps, 3 deployments, 2 of them in places where the air tasted like hot metal and exhaust. And when he came home, he found that silence suited him better than explanation. He was 37 years old, medium height, but built in a way that made medium height look more substantial than it was, with a jaw that sat square under dark stubble, and eyes that were a particular shade of brown that read as almost black in low light. His hair was cropped close on the sides, a little longer on top, and there was a scar along the left side of his neck that disappeared under his collar, a thin, pale line he'd had since Helmand. He wore the same thing nearly every time he came to the VA, a dark olive field jacket, worn gray at the elbows, jeans, and steel-toed boots that had outlasted 2 soles already. Bruno walked beside him at a controlled heel, 76 pounds of German shepherd with a sable coat that ran from near black at his back and shoulders through rich tan at his chest and legs. His ears were large, fully upright, and rotated with the minor sounds of the corridor before Colt registered them. He wore a plain, dark canvas working vest with a side handle and a worn leather nameplate that read Bruno in block letters. He was 6 years old and had come out of a military working dog program with a hip issue that grounded him from a patrol work at 5. The hip had mostly healed. The training had not gone anywhere. On the way back to the truck that Tuesday, Colt cut through the ambulance bay because the main entrance was crowded with a group of family members he did not want to navigate around. He did not expect to see anything in the ambulance bay. He rarely did. He saw a hospital gurney on the apron outside the bay doors. He saw a man on it. The man was old. Colt put him at 80 or close to it, with a deeply lined face and the very white hair of someone who had spent decades in weather. He was thin in the way long illness makes people thin, a thinning that starts from the inside and works its way out until the person looks like they are being slowly erased. A blue hospital blanket covered him to the chest, and it was already darkening at the shoulders from the rain. Colt stopped. Bruno stopped. There were no orderlies. There was no family. There was no one standing beside the gurney, no one at the bay doors watching. The automatic doors were closed. The man was alone on a concrete apron in the November rain. Bruno's nose went up. Not a threat signal, not the low stiffening he did when something was wrong that way. It was something more careful, a reading of the air, and then he pressed forward against the leash with a slow insistence that Colt had learned not to ignore. Colt walked over. The man's eyes were open. They were pale blue and slightly watered from the cold or something else, and they moved to Colt with the deliberate effort of someone who was making sure they were not imagining him. "Cold," the man said. His voice was a particular kind of thin, the kind that has been a strong voice for most of a life. "Yes, sir," Colt said. "You're wet, too." The man looked at the blanket. "I suppose so." Colt looked at the bay doors, then at the entrance cameras. He looked at the man's wrist and saw a hospital bracelet, blue ink on white plastic, and read the name printed there without meaning to hold it. He was not someone who invaded privacy. He read names when they were in front of him. Rupert Graves. "Are you waiting for someone?" Colt asked. The man's jaw moved without producing a word for a moment. Then he said, "They said they needed the bed." Bruno sat down next to the gurney without a command, close enough that his shoulder touched the wheel. There was a long pause in which Colt Deering understood the situation more completely than he wanted to. He turned around, pushed both hands through the automatic bay doors before they finished opening, and walked back inside. What happened in the next 6 minutes was not dramatic by the standards of the things Colt had lived through. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten anyone. He found the charge nurse at the station nearest the bay, a woman in her 40s named Sylvia, with the expression of someone who has heard every possible complaint at least twice, and he said 3 sentences. The second sentence was that there was a patient in a hospital bracelet sitting in the rain on the ambulance apron. The third sentence was that he was going to stand beside that patient until someone came out. He went back outside. He stood beside the gurney in the rain with his hand on the rail and Bruno at his knee. Sylvia came out 4 minutes later with a young orderly and a look on her face that had shifted substantially from the one she'd been wearing at the station. "Mr. Graves," she said, and there was something careful in her voice now. "We're going to get you back inside." Rupert Graves looked at Colt. He did not say anything. The way he looked was a thing Colt filed away without quite knowing why. They took the gurney back through the doors. Colt stood in the rain for another moment, watching the bay doors close, then walked back to his truck. He sat in it for 20 minutes before he started the engine. Bruno rested his head on the center console. The rain was steady on the roof. That was a Tuesday in November. By the following Monday, Colt knew considerably more about Rupert than a name on a wristband, and none of what he had learned made him want to walk away. Rupert had served in the Army, not the Marines, a fact that the man was mildly sheepish about when he found out who had come back for him in the ambulance bay. He'd done 2 tours in Vietnam, the second of which ended in a field hospital and a medical discharge at 22. He had come home to a small city in central Ohio, married a woman named Frances, built a carpentry business that ran for 31 years, and raised 2 sons who had both left the state before he turned 60. Frances had died 4 years ago. The business had been sold years before that, when Rupert's hands could no longer manage the fine work. He lived alone in a house on Dunbar Street that was paid for and needed a new roof. He had been admitted to the VA 3 weeks earlier following a cardiac event. His chart listed no emergency contact. Colt found most of this out from Diane, who found the rest of it in the system after Colt came to her office the Wednesday, following the rain incident, and sat down across from her desk with Bruno and told her what he had seen. Diane was 53 years old and had worked at that VA for 22 years. She had the look of someone who had decided a long time ago that bureaucratic anger was an indulgence she could not afford. When Colt finished, She was quiet for a moment in the way people are quiet when they are not deciding how to respond, but deciding how much of what they already think to say. He should have had a patient advocate, she said. He should have had someone called. He didn't? No? She pulled up something on her screen. He doesn't have a listed next of kin within contact range. Sons are in Arizona and Georgia. There's no record of them being notified. Colt looked at the window. How does that happen? Diane set her pen down on the desk with a small click that was not quite composed. It shouldn't. He went to visit Rupert the following Saturday. He brought Bruno in a paper bag with a turkey sandwich and a cup of soup from the diner 3 blocks over because he did not trust himself to know what was appropriate to bring a recovering cardiac patient in a VA bed, and a turkey sandwich seemed difficult to object to. Rupert was in a room with one other bed, which was empty. He was sitting up at about 45 degrees, with the muted news on the television in the corner, and his hands resting on the blanket, with the particular stillness of someone who has been in a hospital bed long enough that stillness has become a habit. He was, Colt realized, a taller man than the gurney had made him seem. Even diminished by illness and the flatness of the bed, there was the shape of a large frame underneath the hospital gown. His white hair was combed. His eyes, which had been watered and slightly unfocused in the rain, were clear. He looked at Colt for a moment, then at Bruno, and something in his face changed in a small way. You brought a dog, he said. He comes with me. Bruno walked forward without a command, right to the side of the bed, and sat. He looked at Rupert with the full attention he reserved for people he had decided to take seriously. Rupert reached out and put his hand on Bruno's head. His fingers were very large, even thinned by age, with the knuckles of a man who had spent decades with tools. Bruno held still. Good dog, Rupert said. Not the automatic way people say it. The way someone says it when they mean it as an observation about the world. Colt set the sandwich and soup on the bedside table and pulled the chair from the wall and sat down. They talked for about 2 hours, which surprised him. He had not expected to talk for 2 hours. He had expected to stay for 40 minutes and leave. Rupert talked about Frances with a plainness that was not easy to listen to and also not possible to stop listening to. He talked about her the way people who have been married a very long time talk about the person they lost, which is to say he talked about her in present tense half the time and past tense the other half without seeming to notice the shift. He had a specific story about a kitchen chair she had repaired with the wrong color stain and simply declared it an improvement. And the way he told it made Colt understand exactly who Frances Graves had been as a human being. He did not talk much about Vietnam. Colt did not ask. There were things people said in their own time and things they never said, and the distinction was usually visible if you paid attention. Colt came back on Tuesday with Bruno after the therapy rounds. He came back on Saturday again with a different sandwich. On the 3rd Saturday, Rupert told him that the doctor had mentioned discharge in the coming week or 2, and his voice when he said it was not quite as steady as everything else about him. Back to Dunbar Street? Colt asked. That's the idea. You have somebody coming to stay? Rupert looked at the window. Outside it was still November, darker and colder. I'll manage. Colt looked at him. Bruno looked at him. The dog's ears had shifted forward slightly. Okay, Colt said. He did not push. He was already thinking. He talked to Diane again on Thursday. He found out that there was no scheduled follow-up care plan, that the discharge paperwork had listed Rupert's sons as contacts, but that neither had confirmed, and that there was a note in the file about the roof needing inspection before the discharge could be formally cleared. The roof? Colt said. Apparently, it was flagged during a home assessment they did back when he was admitted. If there's structural concern, they can't clear him to go home to it. Colt said, when was the assessment? 3 weeks ago. And nobody's followed up on the roof. Diane did not answer that, which was its own answer. He drove to Dunbar Street on Friday afternoon. The house was a modest 2-story frame house set back from the sidewalk on a narrow lot, the kind of house that had been built in the mid-century and maintained by someone who cared about it, though the caring had gotten harder in recent years. The yard was tidy enough. The gutters sagged on the east side, and the roof, which he could see from the truck, had 3 or 4 patches of missing shingle on the south face, and one area near the chimney where the decking underneath looked soft. He sat in the truck for a while. He was not a roofer. He had some general experience with construction from the years after his first deployment, when he had worked with a crew in Kentucky for 8 months. And he knew enough to know that the soft patch near the chimney was the problem, and the rest was manageable. He also knew he was not being asked. He had not been asked to sit in the rain with a stranger either. He made 3 phone calls on Saturday morning. The first was to a man named Dennis Pruitt, who he had met through the Thursday night veterans group he attended when he remembered to go, and who did roofing work and had mentioned on more than one occasion that he owed Colt a favor for reasons neither of them needed to enumerate here. The second call was to a woman named Joyce Ostrander, who ran the lunch program at the church 3 blocks from the VA and who had the organizational capacity of someone who had been running logistics since before either of them was born. The third call was to his own voicemail, which he used sometimes to leave himself notes he did not want to write down. The voicemail said simply, "Tuesday, tell Diane, don't make it complicated." Dennis showed up at the house on Dunbar Street that Sunday with his nephew in a truck and had the soft section pulled and resheathed by noon. The new shingles went on by 3. Colt helped from the ground with materials and stayed out of the way when he wasn't useful. Bruno sat in the truck bed with his head resting on the tailgate and watched the whole operation with the patience of a dog who understood that some things simply needed doing. Colt told Diane on Monday that the roof was repaired and could be inspected. He sent her the name of the company Dennis worked for, with Dennis's phone number, and said that Dennis would provide documentation without charge if the hospital needed a formal record. Diane looked at him for a moment across her desk. "You had that roof fixed," she said. "Dennis Pruitt fixed it." "On your arrangement?" "On a favor." She looked back at her screen. "I'll get the inspection scheduled." The inspection cleared on Wednesday. Discharge was set for Friday. Colt was in the room on Friday morning when the paperwork came through. He had brought coffee this time, 2 cups from the diner, and Bruno was lying at the foot of the bed in the particular arranged way he had when he decided a spot was his for the duration. Rupert signed the forms. He did it slowly, with the deliberate care of a man whose hands once made precise things, and who had not forgotten what precision meant even when the hands could no longer fully manage it. When he was done, he set the pen down and looked at Colt. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right." "Why did you come back in that Tuesday? You could have kept walking." Colt thought about this. He did not think about it long, but he thought about it honestly. "Bruno stopped," he said. Rupert looked at the dog. Bruno's tail moved once. "Good dog," Rupert said again. Still the same tone. The observation rather than the reflex. They drove to Dunbar Street in Colt's truck, with Rupert in the passenger seat and a bag of his things in the back beside Bruno. The house looked the same from the outside, except the roof was different if you knew to look. Rupert noticed it when they pulled up. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked at the south face of the roof, at the new shingles that were a shade slightly lighter than the old ones, and his jaw moved. "That was Frances's complaint," he said finally. "The roof. She mentioned it every spring." Colt said, "It'll match better once the weather gets at it." Rupert nodded. He got out of the truck with the careful step of a man relearning the relationship between his body and the ground, and walked up to the front door and stood there with his key in his hand. And Colt noticed that he didn't put the key in right away. He understood what that was. It was the moment of standing outside the place where your life had been, knowing that the person who made it, that was not inside. Frances had been in that house, now only the house was. Rupert put the key in. He turned it. He opened the door. They stayed that afternoon until 5. Colt and Bruno moved through the house with him, partly to help with bags, but mostly because the house needed not to be empty for a while. Colt went through the kitchen and the bathroom for anything that had expired or gone off while Rupert was at the VA. He found 2 things and dealt with them without mentioning it. He checked the furnace and the water heater with the quiet, systematic thoroughness of someone who checks things as a matter of course. Joyce Ostrander arrived at 4:30 with a container of soup and a covered pan of something that smelled like pot roast, and a woman in her 50s named Carol, who apparently helped with the lunch program and had decided that Rupert was now within her operational radius. Carol had strong opinions about proper labeling of food containers and shared them. Rupert bore this with the dignity of a man who recognized that someone else's certainty was sometimes a form of care. Bruno accepted a piece of pot roast from Carol's hand, which Carol took as a personal endorsement. When Colt finally stood up to leave, Rupert walked him to the door. Bruno went ahead, already at the porch. "I'm going to say something," Rupert said. Colt waited. "Frances would have liked you. She was good at knowing who people were. Better than me. She would have known in about 10 minutes. Colt did not have an answer for that. He tried to find one and couldn't. "She used to say," Rupert continued, "that you know a person by what they do when no one's watching, which is not a new idea, but she had a way of meaning it." The porch light was on. The street was quiet. Somewhere down the block, someone was raking leaves in the dark, which seemed optimistic. "I'll come by Tuesday," Colt said. "I know you will," Rupert said. He said it like a man who had learned to be careful about trusting that, and who was choosing to trust it anyway. Colt drove home with Bruno in the back. He did not think about what he had done over the past 3 weeks as a coherent sequence of events. He thought about the gurney in the rain, about Rupert's hands on Bruno's head, about the new shingles on the south face of the roof that would match better once the weather got at them. He thought about what Frances Graves had said about people and watching, and found he could not locate anything inside himself that felt like regret. The Tuesday visits continued into December. Then they continued into January. Colt brought soup from the diner, which Rupert had begun to characterize with dry exactness as the chicken kind that has more pepper than it ought to. He brought Bruno. He sometimes brought Dennis, who found small things around the house that wanted attention, and attended to them while Rupert watched from the kitchen table, with the expression of a craftsman observing another craftsman's works. The sons called eventually. The one in Arizona called first, in December, a week after Colt had spent a Tuesday afternoon rehanging a door in the Rupert's back hallway that had been binding since summer. The call lasted about 15 minutes, and Colt could only hear one side of it, but the one side told him enough. The Arizona son was not a bad person. He was a person with a life at considerable distance, who had gotten used to the distance. He had not known about the cardiac event, because the VA had called a number that was no longer current. And his voice, when he understood that, carried the particular weight of a man who was reckoning with what it means to let a number go out of date. He made a trip out in February. He was a man in his mid-50s named Greg, with his father's frame and much less of his father's stillness, who shook Colt's hand with the grip of someone who was not sure how to account for him, but was attempting to do it respectfully. "He talks about you," Greg said. He said it with a slight hesitation, not unfriendly, but also not pretending it was entirely comfortable information. "And the dog?" "Bruno's easy to talk about." Greg looked at the dog. Bruno was sitting beside Rupert's chair with his chin on the armrest in the way he had settled on as his preferred position in the Dunbar Street house. "My mother would have wanted him to have this," he said. He meant not just Bruno, but the whole arrangement, and they both understood that. The situation that had put Rupert on that ambulance apron in November came to a more formal kind of accounting in January, through a path that Colt had not planned and had only partly set in motion. Diane had filed an internal incident report the day after Colt came to her office. The report had moved through channels in the slow, institutional way such things moved, and it had eventually reached a patient rights coordinator named Marshall Holt, who had the methodical disposition of someone who liked documentation and trusted that documentation, properly accumulated, tended to produce results. Marshall Holt came to see Colt at the VA in January, in a small conference room with a water stain on the ceiling and two chairs that did not quite match. Bruno lay on the floor between them. Marshall asked about what Colt had witnessed. He wrote things down on a legal pad in handwriting that was small and consistent. He asked about the timing, about whether there had been staff present, about what the charge nurse had said and done. Colt answered each question plainly. "You have a good eye for sequence," Marshall said at one point. "I've had to," Colt said. Marshall nodded. He looked at his pad. "The patient was left outside for approximately how long before you encountered him?" "I don't know when he was brought out. I was out there maybe 6 minutes total before the nurse came. Could have been longer before I arrived. And no one else came through the bay in that time. No one stopped." Marshall wrote this down. He closed the pad. He said that the review process would take several months, but that the incident, combined with 2 other reports he indicated were on file from the previous 18 months, had opened a formal inquiry into discharge procedures at that facility. He said the word formal with the particular emphasis people use when they want you to understand that this time it is different. It was different. Colt did not know the full details of what the inquiry found because no one was required to tell him, and he did not push. Diane told him in March that 3 procedural changes had been implemented, that the patient advocacy position had been newly funded for full-time coverage, and that the duty administrator who had authorized the discharge to the ambulance bay had been suspended pending review. She told him this in a hallway, in passing, the way she told him most things. "That's something," Colt said. "It won't fix everything." "No, but it's something." Bruno walked between them on the leash, and his tail made a single, slow movement. Rupert's health steadied through the winter and into spring. His cardiologist adjusted his medication in February and again in March, and the second adjustment seemed to find the right level, because by April he was getting out to the porch in the afternoons and had asked Dennis about the gutters on the east side, which were next. Colt was there the Saturday of the gutter job, holding the ladder and handing things up and doing the parts that wanted someone who wasn't 79 with a cardiac history. It was a cool April morning, the sky a pale gray-white that would burn off later. Rupert was in his lawn chair on the porch with a cup of coffee and an opinion about the angle of the downspout that he offered periodically to whoever would listen. Joyce brought sandwiches at noon. Carol came with her and characterized the gutter situation with the same decisive energy she brought to food labeling. Dennis's nephew, who had been there the day of the roof, found it all very entertaining. At some point in the middle of all of this, Colt was on the ladder with the downspout, and Rupert was talking to no one in particular about the way Frances had organized the back porch for spring every year. A specific and detailed account of where she put things and in what order, and the afternoon light was coming through the trees at the end of the block in the low-angle way of early April, and Bruno was lying at the base of the ladder with his paws crossed, watching the street. Colt listened to Rupert's voice from the ladder, the thin strength of it, the details about the back porch and the placement of the clay pots, and the blue metal chair that was now orange with rust and probably needed to go. He thought about the gurney in the rain. He thought about the moment when the automatic bay doors closed, and there was nothing on the apron but an old man and falling water, and the assumption that the institution had done what was right. He thought about how that happened. Not dramatically. Not through cruelty, exactly. Through neglect and procedure, and the accumulated indifference of busy people who had too many tasks and not enough time and one less thing to worry about if they moved the patient to a holding area and went back inside. He thought about how many Ruperts were on other aprons he had not walked past. He did not know what to do with that thought. He filed it in the same place he filed most of what he had seen in 9 years, which was not a comfortable place, but was a real one. He came down the ladder. He handed the downspout connector to Dennis, who fitted it with the efficiency of someone who had done this several hundred times. He walked over to the porch and sat down in the other chair, the one that was not Rupert's, with a cup of the coffee Joyce had brought. Rupert looked at him. Good work. Dennis did the work. He did the climbing. You held the ladder. Colt said, that's not usually what gets the credit. No, Rupert agreed. He looked at the yard, at Bruno and the grass near the walk, at the street. But it's usually what makes the difference. The afternoon stayed mild. Joyce and Carol left at 2. Dennis and his nephew packed the truck and were gone by 2:30. Colt stayed. He stayed until 5, which was when he usually left on Saturdays. They sat on the porch as the afternoon thinned and the light changed and the neighborhood settled into the particular quiet of late Saturday afternoon. A couple walked a dog past the house. Bruno watched them from the grass with professional interest. Rupert said, I'm going to tell you something Frances always said. Colt waited. She said most people walk past trouble because trouble is heavy to carry and their arms are already full. He set down his cup. She said the people worth knowing are the ones who set down what's in their hands first. The porch light was not on yet. The street was the deep, clear green of April at 5 o'clock. Colt did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. Bruno left the grass and came up the porch steps and settled beside Colt's chair. He put his head down on his paws. The evening was coming on slowly. Colt thought about the drive home, which was 30 minutes. He thought about the empty apartment and the particular quiet it had, which was a different quiet from this. He thought about the 11 weeks of Tuesdays and the Saturdays that had accumulated beside them without anyone assigning him to them. He thought about Rupert's hands in the rain, coming up from the blanket, uncertain. He was not a person who made decisions loudly. He made them in the way the tide makes decisions, which is to say through accumulation, through the slow and patient pressure of everything that has already moved. He said, I was looking at the back porch while Dennis was finishing up. Rupert turned his head. The blue chair, Colt said. I don't think it needs to go. I think it needs stripping and repainting. If you have a preference for the color, I can get the paint on my way by Tuesday." Rupert was quiet for a moment. "She liked a particular shade of green," he said. "It was darker than you'd expect." "I can find it?" "I know you can," Rupert said. There was no fanfare in it. There was only the porch, and the dog, and the April light, and the simple understood fact that Tuesday was not the end of something, and neither was the Tuesday after that. Bruno's tail moved against the deck boards, a slow, unhurried sound. The back porch ran the full width of the house. Francis had kept it in a particular order, and the order had not been kept since, but the bones of the arrangement were still there if you looked. The hook where the string lights had hung, the marks on the deck boards where the table had stood. Rupert had not moved anything. He had also not been able to maintain it, and the gap between those two things was visible. By June, the back porch was maintained again. The blue chair was green. The string lights were restrung from the hook where they had always hung, and on the evenings, when Colt stayed late, they were on, casting the particular amber light that string lights have against the dark of the yard. Colt did not think of himself as having moved in. He had an apartment. He slept there. He was at Dunbar Street most Tuesdays and most Saturdays, and often on a Thursday if something wanted doing, and Bruno had established a clear and unarguable preference for the rug in Rupert's front room. The inquiry finished in late spring. Marshall sent a letter, formal and measured, that outlined the findings and the remedial actions taken. It was addressed to Rupert as the named patient in the original incident report, and Rupert read it at the kitchen table with his reading glasses and his coffee, and set it on the table when he was done. He looked at it for a moment. "Will it help the next one?" he said. Not to Colt specifically. To the air above the table, the way people ask things they're not sure can be answered. "Probably not completely," Colt said. "But some." Rupert nodded. He folded the letter along its original crease and set it on the corner of the table, where he kept the mail he intended to keep. Greg came back in the summer with his wife and his daughter, who was 8 years old and had the social certainty of children who have not yet been told to be afraid of large dogs. She asked Bruno's name the moment she walked in, and then said, with the gravity appropriate to the matter, that she thought it was a very good name. Bruno accepted this assessment without ego. The daughter sat on the back porch with Rupert for 2 hours while her parents talked with Colt and Joyce and Carol, who had come because Joyce always came and Carol always came when Joyce came. Rupert showed her, with the care of someone who had made things for 30 years, how to hold a piece of sandpaper to follow the grain of wood, using the arm of the green chair as a demonstration. She was extremely focused about this. When Greg came to find them, he stood in the doorway for a moment, watching his father instruct his daughter in the proper angle of the wrist. He looked at Colt. "I don't know how to say this exactly," Greg said. "You don't have to," Colt said. "I know." He looked at the porch again. "But I want to." Colt waited. "He was doing okay before," Greg said. "Before she died. Before the health stuff. He managed. This is different from managing." He was quiet a moment. "She would have done exactly what you've done. I don't mean that as a comparison. I just mean she would have recognized it." Colt looked at Rupert, at the particular posture of a man who was teaching something he loved to someone who wanted to learn it. The afternoon was hot, and the yard was full of the sound of insects, and somewhere in the neighbor's yard a sprinkler was turning in its slow arc. "He's easy to come back for," Colt said. "That's the truth of it." Bruno came off the porch and walked to the shade at the edge of the yard and lay down in it with the pragmatic ease of a dog who understood heat management. His ears stayed up. His eyes watched the street. The evening came. People went home. Rupert went to bed at 9:15, which was when he went to bed. The house settled into the quiet it had at the end of a day that had been full. Colt sat on the back porch in the dark with the string lights on, and Bruno at his feet, and thought about nothing in particular for a while. He thought about the drive home and found, without great ceremony, that he did not especially feel like making it. He sat there until 11. Then he turned off the string lights and checked the door locks, the way he had gotten in the habit of checking them, and he went to his truck. He sat in the truck. Bruno watched him from the back seat. He had a lease on his apartment that ran through September. It was the kind of thing that was simple enough to address if you decided you were addressing it. He did not decide anything that night, sitting in the truck. He thought about Francis's rule about people and watching, about what a person does when no one is watching, and he thought that there was a version of that rule that had to do with places as well as people, about what a place reveals when you let it. Dunbar Street in June at 11 at night was quiet, and had the smell of cut grass from somewhere nearby and the sound of the sprinkler next door that had apparently been left on since afternoon. It was not a dramatic place. It was an ordinary place that had gotten considerably less lonely over the course of several months, and it was not entirely clear to Colt whether he had been the one responsible for that, or whether Rupert had, or whether Bruno had decided it for all of them that Tuesday in the rain when he pressed forward against the leash with the slow insistence of a dog who had made up his mind. He did know that the apartment 30 minutes away had never once asked him to stay. He started the truck. He drove home. He called his landlord in the morning. There are people in this world who make space where there was none. They are not always the ones who arrive with speeches or announcements. Sometimes they arrive with a turkey sandwich and a dog on a leash, and they hold a ladder, and they find a paint color that is darker than you would expect. Rupert lived on Dunbar Street for 11 more years. His sons came regularly after that first February, Greg more than the brother in Georgia. And the granddaughter who had learned about sandpaper came every summer until she was old enough to come on her own, and then she came more than her parents did. Bruno lived on the rug in the front room until he was 12, which is a long life for a German shepherd. And Rupert used to say that the dog had made his own decision the day he sat down beside the gurney, and that nobody should take credit for what the dog had decided. Colt moved to the street in September, not into Rupert's house, into the one 3 doors down that had come available. He was there when Rupert's health began to decline again, 3 years after that first November. And he was there for the years after that in the way a person is there who has chosen a place rather than landed in one. At Rupert's funeral, Greg gave the eulogy. He talked about his parents, and about the business, and about the back porch in summer with the string lights. He talked about what it meant to his father to be found in the rain by someone who came back. He talked about Bruno, who had died the year before, and was buried in the yard at the house 3 doors down under the oak that had been there when nobody alive could remember it being planted. Colt sat in the 4th row with Joyce and Carol and Dennis's nephew, who was not so young anymore, and he looked at the picture of Rupert at the front of the room, Rupert at about 50, standing in the workshop with sawdust on his shirt and a look on his face like the world was workable if you kept your hands moving. He thought about the gurney. He thought about the rain. He thought about a dog pressing forward against a leash with a slow insistence that had asked, without words, whether this was going to be one of those times when you kept walking or one of the other kind. There is a person in your life right now, or there will be one, who is sitting in the rain while the doors close around them. not always literally. Sometimes it is something quieter, the unreturned call, the name no one put on the list, the assumption that someone else would come back. You will be given the chance to come back for them. The cost of coming back is smaller than you think. It is almost never as large as the thing you imagine it might be. It is usually a moment, a turn, a decision made in the time it takes a dog to pull forward on a leash, and what you gain in return is something that does not translate easily into words. Though Rupert tried once on the back porch in the summer, with the string lights on and the sound of the sprinkler from next door, looking at the green chair that had been blue and was now the shade Francis had liked. Darker than you would expect. He said it was the feeling of having been worth coming back for. He said it was the best feeling he knew. May you find the person waiting in your rain, and may you have the grace to turn around. May you know the warmth of being the one who comes back, and may the people who love you know the warmth of having you stay. May God bless you and protect your family and everyone you carry in your heart.